Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Alistair Sterling laughed as he poured a vintage Cabernet over Elena Vance's hand-me-down blazer in front of the entire Sterling Vineyard's board of directors. The deep red liquid bloomed across her lapel like a fresh wound, the scent of fermented oak and expensive arrogance filling the air. He didn't pull back, letting the last few drops drip onto her sensible shoes while the room remained suffocatingly silent. "Oh, Elena," he sighed, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that didn't hold a shred of remorse. "I suppose that's what happens when you try to reach for a bottle that costs more than your father's annual pension. You really should learn your place before you trip over it." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cold moisture seeping through the fabric of her shirt, chilling her skin, but she kept her spine rigid against the velvet-backed chair. Across the mahogany table, Julian Sterling snickered into his silk pocket square, while the other board members suddenly found the grain of the wood or the view of the rolling Napa hills intensely fascinating. Only Martha Sterling, Alistair's sister, looked away with a grimace of genuine distaste, her knuckles white as she gripped her fountain pen. "The audit is due on Friday, Alistair," Elena said, her voice low and steady. It was a sharp contrast to the performative theatricality of the man standing over her. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, lint-free cloth, beginning to dab at the stain with clinical precision. He leaned down, invading her personal space until she could smell the expensive cigar smoke clinging to his tailored suit. "The audit is a formality, Elena. My family has run these lands since before your grandfather was digging ditches. You're here to check boxes, not to play detective. Don't let a little spilled wine go to your head." He straightened up, adjusting his gold cufflinks with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence in his 50 years of life. He turned back to the board, dismissing her presence as easily as one might discard a used napkin. "Now, as I was saying, the expansion into the lower valley is proceeding ahead of schedule. We'll be breaking ground on the new bottling facility by the end of the month." Elena watched him. She saw the way he gestured with a heavy gold ring, the way he commanded the room through sheer, unearned gravity. To everyone else in the room, she was a nuisance, a gray-suited auditor from a firm they paid to stay quiet. They saw a woman who lived in a cramped apartment and drove a 10-year-old sedan. They didn't see the digital recorder currently humming in her pocket, capturing every word of his unauthorized expansion plan. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her inner pocket, the one David Vance had handed her in the dead of night. It contained the environmental surveys Alistair had tried to bury, the ones proving the lower valley expansion was sitting directly on top of a protected watershed. "The lower valley soil is quite complex," Elena remarked, her tone conversational. She didn't look up from her ruined blazer. "I noticed some interesting discrepancies in the irrigation subsidies you claimed last quarter. Almost $3 million shifted into land preparation that doesn't seem to exist on the satellite maps." The room went deathly quiet. Julian stopped laughing. Alistair froze, his hand hovering over a crystal decanter. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, predatory ice. "Careful, Elena," he warned, the smoothness of his voice replaced by a jagged edge. "Accusations like that have a habit of ruining careers. A girl like you with a father in his condition. You can't afford to be wrong." "I'm an auditor, Alistair," she replied, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were as cold as the wine on her chest. "I'm never wrong about the numbers. I just think it's important that we're all on the same page before the harvest dinner on Saturday. It would be such a shame if the investors were surprised by unexpected liabilities." Alistair let out a sharp, barking laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. He walked toward her, his heavy leather shoes thudding against the Persian rug. He stopped inches from her face, his shadow looming over her. "You think you're a threat. You're a mosquito, Elena, and I've spent my whole life crushing things much larger than you." He reached out, his fingers hovering near her stained collar, a gesture of mock intimacy that made her skin crawl. "Clean yourself up. You smell like a cheap cellar. And don't bother coming back tomorrow. Martha will mail you your final check." He turned his back on her, a final, crushing dismissal. The board members began to murmur, the tension breaking as they followed their leader's cue. They began to stand, gathering their leather portfolios, treating her as if she had already vanished from the room. Elena stood up slowly. She didn't look at the wine stain. She didn't look at the mocking smirk Julian threw her way as he followed his father toward the double oak doors. She looked at Martha, who was watching her with a strange, unreadable expression, a mixture of fear and something that looked suspiciously like hope. Elena tucked her cloth back into her bag. She felt a strange sense of calm, a predatory stillness she hadn't known she possessed. Alistair Sterling thought he had just ended a nuisance. He had no idea he had just handed her the final piece of the puzzle. She walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. As she reached the elevator, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "David," she said, her voice echoing in the empty hallway. "He just confirmed the expansion timeline in front of the entire board. He thinks he's untouchable." She paused, watching her reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors. The red stain on her blazer looked like a badge of office. "Start the countdown," she whispered. "We have 72 hours until the harvest dinner. I want everything ready." She ended the call and stepped into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, she reached up and touched the small, vintage pearl earring she wore, the only thing her father had managed to keep from the Sterling family's greed. The lion was no longer sleeping, and the harvest was going to be much more expensive than Alistair Sterling could ever imagine. The next morning, the sun crawled over the rolling hills of the vineyard, but the light felt cold inside Alistair Sterling's private office. The air here was heavy, thick with the cloying, fermented scent of overripe grapes and the expensive mahogany polish of furniture that had been bought with other people's sweat. Alistair sat behind his desk, his fingers tracing the edge of a land deed as if it were a trophy. Beside him stood Julian Sterling, who was currently swirling a glass of amber liquid despite the early hour. The favored son looked every bit the part of the arrogant heir, his silk tie perfectly knotted, and a smirk playing on his lips that suggested he'd already won a race he hadn't even started. "She's late," Julian remarked, his voice dripping with the casual boredom of the ultra-wealthy. "I told you, Father, giving her any authority over the audit was a mistake. People like the Vances don't understand the value of time. They only understand the value of a paycheck." Alistair didn't look up. "Elena Vance will be here. She knows what's at stake. Her father's legacy is currently a pile of debt and a plot of land that sits directly in the path of my expansion. She'll sign the release. She has no choice." The door opened with a sharp, decisive click. Elena stepped into the room, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. She wore the same blazer from the day before, the red wine stain now a faint, scrubbed-out ghost of Alistair's previous tantrum. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply walked to the desk and set her briefcase down on the polished wood. "You're 10 minutes behind, Elena," Alistair said, finally looking up. His eyes were like flint, devoid of any warmth. "I hope you spent that time reconsidering your position on the survey land. My lawyers have already drafted the transfer. It's a generous offer, considering David's survey results are, shall we say, flexible." He slid a heavy, cream-colored document across the desk. It was a demand for the Vance family's ancestral plot, the very land her father had spent his life protecting. "My brother's survey isn't flexible, Alistair," she replied, her voice steady and low. "It's accurate. The soil toxicity levels near the new bottling plant are rising. If you expand over that land, you're burying the evidence of 10 years of environmental neglect." Julian let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the smell of expensive scotch and entitlement radiating off him. "Soil toxicity, do you hear yourself? You're an auditor, not a scientist. Stick to the numbers, Vance. Or better yet, stick to the filing. That's what your father was best at before he lost his mind and his money." Elena's nails dug into the leather of her briefcase, but she didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the secret she carried. the cold, hard reality hidden in the small, leather-bound book currently tucked into a hidden compartment of her bag. "I have been sticking to the numbers," she said, her gaze shifting to Alistair. "Which is why I find it interesting that the expansion is being funded by a series of offshore accounts that don't appear on the Sterling Crest main balance sheet. Where is the capital coming from, Alistair?" The room went deathly quiet. The rhythmic thud-thud of the wine press outside seemed to grow louder, echoing the pounding of her heart. Alistair's face didn't change, but his grip on his gold fountain pen tightened until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. "Be very careful," he whispered, the threat vibrating in the air. "You are an employee, not a partner. You have 48 hours until the harvest dinner. If those land releases aren't signed and the audit isn't closed by the time the first toast is poured, I will ensure David Vance is blacklisted from every surveying contract in the state. And I'll start the foreclosure on your mother's house by Monday morning." He stood up, the chair screeching against the hardwood floor like a wounded animal. "Now, get out. Go back to your spreadsheets and find the errors I told you to find." Elena didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply picked up her briefcase and turned. As she reached the door, she felt the cool weight of the black ledger against her hip, the real book she had found hidden in the floorboards of Martha Sterling's old office. It contained every illegal transaction, every bribe, and the proof that Alistair Sterling was actually bankrupt, propped up only by the very theft he was trying to finalize. She stepped out into the hallway, the sound of Julian's renewed laughter muffled by the heavy door. She pulled out her phone and sent a 2-word text to David: "Harvest dinner." The countdown was no longer 72 hours. It was 48. And the Sterling family was about to find out that the dirt they so despised was exactly what would bury them. The following morning, the scent of burnt coffee and stale grease filled the cramped booth of the Silver Spoon Diner. Elena Vance sat tucked into the corner, her fingers tracing the gritty texture of a sugar packet as she waited. Outside, the fog rolled off the valley floor, obscuring the lush, rolling hills of the Sterling estate that loomed over the town like a feudal castle. David Vance slid into the seat opposite her, his breath hitching. He looked like he hadn't slept. He placed a rugged, mud-stained tablet on the table, its screen flickering with topographical maps and water table data. "You were right about the runoff, Elena," he whispered, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and dread. "But it's worse than just environmental negligence. Alistair isn't just dumping chemicals. He's diverted the natural spring that feeds the town's primary reservoir. He's been bottling the town's water and selling it back to the county under a subsidiary name to cover his interest payments." Elena felt a cold thrill of clarity. She tapped the leather-bound ledger resting in her lap. "And this is the paper trail. He's leveraged the entire vineyard against a series of high-interest loans from a shell company called Apex Viticulture. He thinks he's playing the system, but he's actually borrowed money from his own creditors' competitors. If this gets out," David said, leaning in, "the bank will freeze his assets within the hour. He'll lose the land, the house, everything." Elena glanced at her watch. "Not yet. He needs to be at the harvest dinner. He needs his peers, his investors, and the press to see the mask slip. If we move now, he'll just file for bankruptcy and hide behind his lawyers. I want him to stand in that ballroom and realize he's already a ghost." 10 miles away, the sharp, ozone smell of an approaching storm hung heavy over the Sterling vineyard. Alistair Sterling stood on the veranda, his silk tie fluttering in the rising wind. He didn't look like a man on the brink of ruin. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom he intended to burn for warmth. Julian Sterling stepped out beside him, adjusting his gold cufflinks with a smirk. He held a crystal glass of the estate's private reserve, the deep red liquid catching the gray morning light. "The caterers are complaining about the late payment, Father," he said, his tone bored and dismissive. "And the locals are gathered at the gate again, something about the well water smelling like sulfur." Alistair didn't turn around. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "Tell the caterers they'll be paid double after the dinner, provided the service is flawless. As for the locals, call the sheriff. Tell him they're trespassing on private property." If they want clean water, they can buy it from the grocery store like civilized people. They're calling it the Great Thirst on social media, Julian chuckled, taking a slow, arrogant sip of the wine. It's actually good for branding, makes the sterling label seem even more exclusive. Only the worthy get to drink. Alistair finally turned, his eyes narrowing. Elena Vance was in the office yesterday. She found the errors in the spreadsheets. Julian waved a hand dismissively. The auditor's daughter. She's a mouse, father. She probably went home to cry into her cheap tea. I told her to get out and she scurried. She doesn't have the spine to challenge us. No one in this town does. Alistair nodded, though his jaw remained tight. Make sure the security detail is doubled for tomorrow night. I want no surprises. This dinner is the final piece. Once the new investors sign, the Vance family and their concerns will be a footnote in history. Late that afternoon, Elena stood in the foyer of a small, Victorian-style house on the edge of the estate. The air here smelled of lavender and old paper. Martha Sterling sat in a high-backed chair, a knitted shawl draped over her thin shoulders. Her eyes, though clouded by age, were sharp as flint. He thinks I'm senile, you know, Martha said, her voice a dry rasp. He thinks because I don't leave this house, I don't hear the bones of this family rattling. She reached into a small wooden box on the table beside her and pulled out a tarnished brass key. She pressed it into Elena's palm. The metal was ice gold. Alistair moved the physical records to the cellar of the old bottling plant 3 years ago, she whispered. He thought he burned them. He didn't. He was too arrogant to check the bottom of the crates. My father's original deed is there, Elena. The one that proves the land was never his to leverage. It was held in a trust for the community, a trust Alistair illegally dissolved when he took over. Elena gripped the key, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Why are you helping me, Martha? The older woman looked toward the window, where the Sterling mansion sat like a gargoyle on the hill. Because I'm a Sterling, and I know what we are. We're a blight, and it's time for the harvest. Elena stepped out into the cooling evening air. She pulled out her phone and looked at the countdown on her screen, 24 hours until the harvest dinner. She could almost hear the sound of the iron gates closing. The Sterling family had spent decades building a throne out of other people's debts, never realizing that the foundation was made of glass. She looked up at the darkened sky, the first few drops of rain beginning to fall. Tomorrow, the storm wouldn't just be over the vines. It would be inside the ballroom. She turned toward her car, the weight of the key and the ledger in her bag feeling like a loaded weapon. 24 hours, Alistair, she whispered to the wind. I hope you enjoy your last night as a rich man. 12 hours remained until the first guest would arrive for the harvest dinner. Elena Vance stood on the stone terrace of the Sterling estate, watching a small army of caterers drape white linen over long tables. The air smelled of damp earth and the heavy, sweet rot of overripe grapes, a scent Alistair Sterling called the smell of money, but to Elena, it smelled like decay. She felt the weight of the ledger tucked into the hidden compartment of her laptop bag, the leather strap digging into her shoulder like a physical manifestation of the truth. Below the terrace, the vineyard stretched out in perfect, geometric rows, but she knew the sickness that lay beneath the topsoil. She could almost taste the metallic tang of the chemicals Alistair had pumped into the ground to keep his yields high, while the surrounding small farms withered and died. Alistair stepped out of the French doors, his polished loafers clicking against the flagstone with a rhythmic, predatory snap. He didn't look at the workers. He looked at the horizon, his chin tilted as if he were personally responsible for the sunset. Still here, Elena? He asked, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone dripping with condescension. He didn't turn his head to acknowledge her presence. I thought you'd have scurried back to your father's crumbling porch by now. There's nothing left for you to audit. The books are closed and the verdict is in. I win. I always win. Elena turned to face him, her expression as unreadable as a blank page. Books are never truly closed, Alistair. They just wait for the right person to read the footnotes. He finally looked at her, a smirk playing on his thin lips, the kind of look a man gives an insect he's about to crush. Footnotes are for people who can't afford the main text. You've spent too much time looking at numbers and not enough time looking at power. My family built this valley. We are the foundation, the soil, and the vine. He reached out, flicking a stray speck of dust off her shoulder with a gesture so dismissive it made her pulse thrum with a cold, focused rage. Don't get too comfortable in that cheap blazer. After tonight, I'm making sure the Vance name is scrubbed from every contract in the county. You and your father will be a footnote I personally delete from the history of this estate. Pride goes before the fall, Alistair, or in your case, before the harvest, Elena said quietly. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the USB drive Martha had helped her secure. You should check the vintage on the reserve bottles. Sometimes things age in ways you don't expect. Alistair laughed, a sharp barking sound that didn't reach his eyes. I don't take advice from the help. Now, get out of my sight. I have a legacy to celebrate, and you're ruining the aesthetic. He turned his back on her, shouting a command at a waiter who had dared to place a floral arrangement 2 inches off-center. As Elena walked toward the gravel driveway, she crossed paths with Julian Sterling. He was adjusting his gold cufflinks, looking every bit the heir apparent to a throne built on debt. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took in Elena's steady gait. He had expected her to be broken after the way his father had treated David Vance, but she looked remarkably composed. You're still wearing that same suit, Julian remarked, blocking her path. You'd think with all that auditing, you'd have found a way to embezzle a better wardrobe. I prefer to keep my hands clean, Julian, she replied, her voice steady. It makes it easier to hold onto things when the ground starts to shake. Julian frowned, his arrogant mask slipping for a fraction of a second. He noticed the way she held his gaze without blinking. There was a stillness in her that was unnerving. What is that supposed to mean? It means you should enjoy the wine tonight, Elena said, stepping around him. It's the last time it will ever taste this sweet. She reached her car and pulled out her phone. A message from David Vance sat on the screen. The soil samples are confirmed. The runoff is exactly where we thought. It's undeniable. Elena looked back at the mansion. In the ballroom, the crystal chandeliers were being lit, their light refracting off thousands of glass droplets. It looked beautiful, a shimmering palace of greed. She dialed a number. Martha, it's time. Make sure the environmental board members are seated at the head table. I want them to have a front row seat for the main course. Are you ready, Elena? Martha's voice was a low rasp over the line. The harvest is ready, Elena whispered, watching Alistair appear on the balcony above, raising a glass to his empty kingdom. And I'm the one bringing the scythe. The evening arrived with a deceptive stillness, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the heavy, floral perfume of the local elite. Elena Vance stood at the edge of the Sterling Estate's north ridge, her heels sinking slightly into the soft, dark soil that Alistair Sterling was so eager to pave over. A massive white marquee glowed like a paper lantern against the darkening sky, and the sound of a string quartet fought against the low rumble of generators. She adjusted the strap of her modest black dress, feeling the cold weight of the flash drive tucked into her inner pocket. It felt like a leaden anchor, grounding her while the rest of the world floated on bubbles of expensive champagne. You look like you're attending a funeral, Elena, a voice drawled behind her. She didn't need to turn to recognize Julian Sterling. He stepped into her line of sight, swirling a glass of deep red vintage that probably cost more than her monthly mortgage. He looked every bit the favored heir in his tailored tuxedo, his smirk radiating a practiced, inherited condescension. I prefer to think of it as being appropriately dressed for the occasion, she replied, her voice level. Julian chuckled, a dry, mocking sound. He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive tobacco and arrogance clinging to him. My father was worried you'd lose your nerve. He said auditors are like barnacles, hard to scrub off, but ultimately insignificant. You're only here because he likes an audience when he wins. Try not to spill anything on the carpet. It's imported. He didn't wait for a response, bumping his shoulder against hers as he walked past, a deliberate move intended to remind her of her place. Elena's fingers curled into her palms, her nails digging into her skin, but she didn't flinch. She watched him rejoin a group of young men who laughed at a joke she knew was at her expense. She turned her gaze toward the head table. Martha Sterling was already seated, her posture rigid, her pearls catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. Beside her sat 3 members of the Regional Environmental Board, looking impressed by the opulence surrounding them. Martha caught Elena's eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The pieces were moving. The crowd began to migrate toward the rope-off area, where a row of ceremonial golden shovels stood planted in a mound of fresh dirt. Alistair stood at the center of the spectacle, his silver hair gleaming under the spotlights. He was holding court, his hand resting familiarly on the shoulder of the county supervisor. "It's a legacy project," Alistair's voice boomed, carrying easily over the hushed crowd. "We aren't just building a cellar, we're anchoring the Sterling name into this bedrock for another century. Some people, small-minded people, fear progress. They hide behind clipboards and regulations because they lack the vision to see what this land can truly become." He glanced toward Elena, his eyes glinting with a predatory triumph. "But visionaries don't ask for permission. We create reality." A ripple of polite laughter and applause followed. Elena felt a vibration in her clutch. She pulled out her phone, shielding the screen. A message from David Vance. "The live feed to the board's tablets is primed. Just give the word." She looked back at the mound of dirt. Underneath that carefully manicured surface lay the toxic runoff David had mapped, the chemical rot that Alistair had spent millions trying to bury. The very soil he was about to celebrate was the evidence of his greatest crime. Alistair stepped toward the golden shovels, his movements grand and theatrical. He gripped the handle of the center shovel, the polished metal reflecting the hungry glow of the cameras. "I've spent 40 years building this kingdom," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a dramatic, intimate register that made the board members lean in. "And tonight, we break ground on its crown jewel. I've heard rumors of concerns regarding our environmental impact. Let this be my answer." He looked directly at Elena, his lip curling into a sneer of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "To those who spent their lives looking for dirt, I hope you enjoy watching me turn it into gold." The rage that had been a slow simmer in Elena's chest for weeks suddenly turned into a cold, crystalline clarity. She watched him adjust his grip on the shovel, his chest puffed out, the embodiment of a man who believed he was untouchable. He thought he was inviting her to his coronation. He had no idea he had invited her to his deposition. "Wait for it," she whispered to herself, the words lost in the rising murmur of the crowd. Alistair raised the shovel high, a conductor about to start a symphony of destruction. The photographers crowded forward, their flashes firing in a rhythmic, blinding strobe. The board members smiled, ready to sign off on the future of the valley. Elena reached into her bag and pressed a single button on her phone. Across the tent, the 3 environmental board members frowned simultaneously. One of them pulled a tablet from his briefcase, his brow furrowing as a red alert began to pulse on the screen. He looked from the device to the ground, then back to the screen, his face draining of its professional warmth. Alistair, oblivious to the shift in the room's energy, plunged the golden shovel into the earth with a grunt of exertion. He heaved a large clod of dirt into the air, his face set in a mask of triumphant joy. But as the soil hit the light, a sharp, chemical tang wafted through the air, a smell like scorched rubber and bitter almonds that cut through the expensive perfumes like a blade. The board member with the tablet stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the platform. Alistair froze, his shovel still buried in the mound. He looked up, his smile faltering as he saw the expression on the official's face. "Mr. Sterling," the board member said, his voice echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence of the tent. "We need to talk about what's in this soil, right now." Elena stepped forward, the shadow of the marquee falling across her face. She met Alistair's gaze, and for the first time in his life, she saw the flicker of genuine, cold-blooded fear behind the wolf's eyes. "The harvest is here, Alistair," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "And it's exactly what you planted." The silence inside the marquee was suffocating, thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, medicinal tang of the unearthed soil. Alistair Sterling stood frozen, his designer loafers stained with the very earth he had claimed would be his legacy. He looked at the board member, then at the tablet, his chest heaving under his bespoke linen suit. "This is an outrage," Alistair snapped, his voice regaining its jagged edge. He pointed a trembling finger at David Vance, who stood at the edge of the crowd with his arms crossed. You've contaminated this site. You're trying to sabotage the Sterling name because your own father couldn't cut it in this industry. Security, remove this man and his daughter immediately." Elena Vance didn't move. She felt the weight of the digital file in her hand, a silent weapon she had spent months sharpening. The murmur of the crowd grew, a low, buzzing sound like a hornet's nest disturbed. Julian Sterling stepped forward, his face pale as he looked from the blackened soil to his father. He reached for the tablet, his hand shaking. "Dad, look at the readings," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "The toxicity levels, they aren't fresh. This has been leaching into the groundwater for years." Alistair sneered, his eyes flashing with a desperate, cornered light. "Don't be a fool, Julian. It's a glitch. A setup by a jealous auditor who couldn't find a real discrepancy if it hit her in the face." He turned his venom on Elena, stepping into her personal space, the smell of vintage scotch and arrogance radiating off him. "You're a parasite, Elena. You crawled back here looking for a handout, and when I didn't give you one, you decided to play chemist. Do you have any idea who I am? I built this county. I own the ground you're standing on." "Actually," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady blade that sliced through his shouting, "you don't." She turned toward the large display screen at the front of the tent, the one intended to show a 3D render of the new tasting room. With a single tap on her phone, the image flickered and died. In its place, a series of scanned documents appeared, internal memos with Alistair's unmistakable, looping signature, detailing the illegal disposal of industrial runoff beneath the North Vineyard. Beside them, bank statements showed the systematic draining of the Sterling Estates pension fund to cover the mounting fines he'd been hiding for a decade. The room went deathly quiet. Martha Sterling let out a sharp, jagged gasp, her hand flying to her throat as she saw her own forged signature on a secondary loan document. Alistair's face underwent a violent transformation. The ruddy, wine-flushed glow of his triumph vanished, replaced by a gray, waxy pallor that made his skin look like wet parchment. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his bottom lip trembling as his eyes darted frantically toward the exit. The veins in his neck bulged, thick and blue, as he struggled to swallow a truth that was choking him. The arrogance that usually sat on his shoulders like a royal robe had vanished, leaving him looking small, withered, and terrifyingly old. The lead board member stepped back, looking at Alistair as if he were a leper. The local reporter in the front row was already recording, the lens of the camera capturing every second of the Sterling patriarch's collapse. "Those memos are from the 2014 audit," Elena continued, her eyes never leaving Alistair's. "The one you told my father he'd missed. You didn't just bury the chemicals, Alistair. You buried him under the blame. But David found the runoff, and Martha found the paper trail you thought you de-shredded. You can't prove." Alistair stuttered, his voice a pathetic wheeze. He looked at Julian, but his son took a deliberate step back, joining Martha. The favored son was gone. There was only a witness left. Elena stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow echoed in the silence. "I'm not here to save the vineyard, Alistair. I'm here to bury it, just like you did to my father." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't need to see him fall to his knees or hear the excuses that were already bubbling up in his throat. Elena turned her back on the wreckage of the Sterling Empire and walked toward the exit of the marquee. As she stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the sound of the first siren began to wail in the distance, a long, mournful note that signaled the end of a dynasty. Behind her, the tent was no longer a celebration. It was a crime scene. The wail of the sirens grew from a distant hum to a deafening shriek, vibrating through the heavy canvas of the marquee. Inside, the air had turned frigid, the celebratory warmth of the vintage wine replaced by the metallic tang of impending disaster. Alistair Sterling stood frozen at the center of the wreckage, his hand still clutching a crystal glass that now looked absurdly fragile. He turned toward the entrance, expecting his security team to sweep in and clear the room, but the men in suits who stepped through the flap weren't on his payroll. Alistair's face didn't just pale, it seemed to physically dissolve. The arrogance that had served as his armor for decades drained away, leaving behind a hollow, sagging mask of a man. His jaw went slack, his lower lip trembling with a frantic, rhythmic twitch that he couldn't suppress. The ruddy, sun-drenched color of his cheeks turned a sickly, bruised gray, and his eyes, once sharp and predatory, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the exits like a trapped animal. He looked less like a titan of industry, and more like a man who had just watched his own ghost walk past him. His breathing came in shallow, jagged hitches that rattled in his chest, audible even over the murmurs of the crowd. "This is a mistake," he wheezed, the words barely catching on his tongue. He looked toward the rows of investors, the men and women who had toasted his genius only 20 minutes prior. "Julian, tell them this is a fabrication by a disgruntled employee." Julian didn't move. He stood 3 paces away, his shadow falling across his father's polished shoes. The favored son didn't offer a hand or a defensive word. Instead, he reached up and slowly unpinned the Sterling family crest from his lapel, letting the gold trinket fall into the trampled grass. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the snapping of the marquee's heavy plastic flaps in the rising wind. Martha stepped forward then, her heels clicking sharply against the temporary wooden flooring. She held a thick manila envelope, the edges frayed from years of hiding. She didn't hand it to her brother. She handed it to the lead investigator, a woman with a face as hard as flint. "The offshore accounts are listed on page 12, Martha said, her voice devoid of the warmth she usually reserved for family. "The runoff maps David Vance prepared are on page 20. They match the soil toxicity reports perfectly." Alistair lunged toward her, a desperate, clumsy movement that was intercepted before he could get within arm's reach. "You traitor," he hissed, the venom returning to his voice even as his power evaporated. "Everything you have, I gave you. This vineyard is the Sterling legacy." "No, Alistair," she replied, looking at him with a pity that seemed to sting worse than any insult. "The vineyard was a gift from our father. You just turned it into a crime scene." The witnesses, the cream of the valley's social circle, began to move. It wasn't a sudden rush, but a slow, deliberate pulling away. The CEO of the region's largest bank took a step back, then another, his face twisted in a mask of professional disgust. A prominent socialite, who had been laughing at Alistair's jokes an hour ago, clutched her silk shawl tighter and turned her back, whispering to her husband about the stench of the scandal. Within minutes, a physical circle of empty space had formed around the man who used to own the room. David Vance appeared at the edge of the light, his boots caked in the very mud Alistair had tried to hide. He didn't say a word. He simply stood by the investigators, a silent testament to the land that had finally fought back. Elena watched the scene from the shadows of the exit, her pulse steady for the first time in years. She felt the weight of the secret she had carried, the burden of being the auditor who knew too much, finally lift. The smell of the expensive lilies decorating the tables now felt suffocating, cloying and sweet like a funeral parlor. She reached into her pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of her father's old pocket watch, the one Alistair had mocked for being working class. Alistair caught her eye across the room. For a second, the old fire returned, a flash of pure, entitled rage. "You think you've won? You're nothing, Elena. You'll be back in some cubicle by Monday While you what, Alistair?" Elena interrupted, her voice cutting through his frantic rambling like a blade. She stepped back out into the crisp afternoon air, the sun setting behind the hills he no longer controlled. "You spent so much time telling me I didn't belong in your world. You were right." "I don't." She paused, looking at the flashing blue lights reflecting off the vineyard's pristine glass conservatory. But then again, she added, her voice dropping to a cold, final whisper, neither do you. Enjoy the vintage, Alistair. It's the last one you'll ever taste. She didn't wait for the handcuffs to click. She didn't need to see the final indignity of him being led away in front of the cameras that were already gathering at the gates. Elena turned and walked toward her car, the sound of her own footsteps on the gravel the only rhythm she cared to follow. Behind her, the Sterling Empire wasn't just falling. It was being erased by the very truth it had tried to bury. As she pulled away, she didn't look in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was finally clear. 6 months later, the air in the valley had turned from the suffocating heat of scandal to the crisp, honest chill of late autumn. Elena Vance stood on the ridge overlooking the vines, her boots sinking into the damp, dark earth that finally smelled of life rather than chemical runoff. The Sterling sign that once dominated the entrance had been hauled away months ago, replaced by a modest timber archway marking the entrance to the Vance Heritage Trust. She pulled her wool coat tighter against the wind, listening to the rhythmic snip-snip of pruning shears echoing from the lower slopes. It was a productive sound, devoid of the frantic, ego-driven energy that had defined this place for decades. Elena had spent the last 24 weeks untangling the web of offshore accounts and falsified environmental reports, a process that felt less like accounting and more like an exorcism. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Martha Sterling, who was currently overseeing the transition of the family's remaining liquid assets into a scholarship fund for local agricultural students. Martha had been the one to provide the final ledger that broke the case wide open, and in doing so, she had found a strange, quiet peace. She no longer wore the heavy gold jewelry that had once seemed like armor. Now, she sent Elena photos of her garden and updates on the legal proceedings. The proceedings were nearly over. Elena had seen the headlines this morning while sitting in a small, sun-drenched cafe in the village. Alistair Sterling had been denied his final appeal. The man who once boasted that his name was the only currency that mattered in this county was now a ward of the state, his empire liquidated to pay for the environmental cleanup he had tried so desperately to hide. Later that afternoon, Elena had to drive into the village for a meeting with the county surveyor. As she pulled her modest sedan into a spot near the local grocery store, she saw a figure standing by the bus stop. Alistair looked smaller than she remembered. The sharp, predatory edge of his silhouette had been blunted by a cheap, ill-fitting windbreaker. He was holding a plastic bag containing a single loaf of bread and a carton of milk. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and gray, windswept in a way that made him look elderly rather than distinguished. He noticed her car. For a second, that old, familiar spark of arrogance flared in his eyes. He straightened his shoulders, perhaps preparing to deliver one last status-based insult about her choice of vehicle or her lack of breeding. But as Elena stepped out of the car, the fire died. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the keys to the estate hanging from her belt. He saw the folder in her hand bearing the official seal of the trust. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The man who had spent a lifetime demanding the world bow to him now had to wait for a public bus because his fleet of luxury cars had been seized by the creditors. Elena felt a brief, sharp spike of the old rage, remembering the way he had once poured wine over her shoes and told her she was nothing, but it was quickly replaced by a profound, hollow pity. "The harvest is looking good this year, Alistair," she said, her voice calm and steady. "The soil is finally clean." He flinched at the mention of the soil, the very thing he had poisoned in his pursuit of profit. He turned his head away, staring down at the cracked pavement, his knuckles white as he gripped his plastic bag. He was a ghost in his own kingdom, a man whose legacy had been erased by the very truth he thought he could bury. Elena didn't wait for a response. She had a meeting to attend. As she walked toward the surveyor's office, she thought of Julian Sterling. He hadn't stayed for the aftermath. The favored son had fled to the city the moment the handcuffs clicked on his father's wrists, unable to face the reality of a world where his name carried no weight. He sent Elena a brief, stilted email every few weeks, but the bridge between them had been burned by the same fire that consumed the estate. That was the cost of justice, a quiet, empty space where a friendship used to be. She found her father, David Vance, waiting for her on the porch of the office. He looked healthier than he had in years, the sallow tint of his skin replaced by a rugged, outdoor glow. He was holding a map of the new irrigation lines, his fingers tracing the paths that would bring fresh water to the valley. "You ready, El?" he asked, a small, proud smile touching his lips. Elena looked back toward the bus stop, but the bus had already come and gone. The bench was empty. She turned back to her father and nodded, the weight of the past finally lifting. "I'm ready," she said. She reached out and touched the rough, sun-warmed wood of the porch railing, a sensory anchor in a world that finally felt solid. The Sterling name was gone, but the land remained. And for the first time in her life, Elena knew exactly where she belonged.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.